Hello, I'm Ryan Black, and we are going to be taking a dive into dynamic processors. If you looked at the first video, the intro to processor, audio processors specifically, I broke it down into three primary categories. Those include dynamic processors, spectral processors, and temporal processors. What we're going to do in this video is break specifically down dynamic processors. These processors are used to affect the amplitude of an audio signal. So the amplitude meaning the dynamic range of the signal. And this can be done in two ways. We can either expand the dynamic range or we can contract the dynamic range. We can make it smaller. The first two units here, compressors and limiters, make the dynamic range less, which can sometimes be a little difficult to understand because you'll hear people say things like compressors make things louder, but they don't. They actually compress the dynamic range of a signal. That does not equate to being louder. What it does give us, though, is the ability to turn a signal up without distorting. And we're going to look into exactly what that means in 1 second. Gates and expanders are similar units, but they go the opposite direction. What this means is if a signal has a certain range where there's areas that you'd like to hear and other areas that you don't want to hear, you can take those areas that are quieter and turn them down even more, right? And we're going to look at a graph that I think will demonstrate this clearly. You may have noticed I kind of left out limiters and expanders in that short explanation. Limiters and expanders are, I would argue, modifications of compressors and gates. And so we'll discuss that in a second as well. All right, let's start with compressors. This graph, while it might look technical and boring, can give us a really great understanding of how a compressor works over time. And what's key about audio, unlike say photography or even video to some degree, is there's no way for us to experience it without time passing. Regardless of what you see on a waveform on a computer, it really doesn't equate to what is actually going on. You have to hear it. So in our graph, I try, though you don't always need it, as you'll see in a second, to incorporate graphs that will show us a time domain as well. Here, time is moving left to right along the x-axis, and the general level is on the y-axis, the vertical axis. The blue line that you can see up here where it says input level represents an incoming signal. So we can see the signal comes in and then immediately gets louder for some period of time and then immediately gets quieter back to the original level that it came in at 0 dB. So it comes in at 0, increases by 9 decibels, and then suddenly decreases back to 0 dB and goes out. That's pretty simple, right? You can see that as like right? For example, that's what the blue line shows us. Now the red line represents the output. This means after the compressor has affected the signal. And what a compressor does is the following. It has a threshold point, and anything that is above that threshold point will be affected. And affected, in this case, means the volume will be turned down. So, when the signal is below our threshold point, which is represented by this black line here, when it's below that, the compressor doesn't do anything. But when the signal goes above that, the compressor will engage. And that is what we are seeing in this first gray time period here. From this top corner here to the end of the gray section is the compressor beginning to engage. And in that process, we see it bring the volume level down. And one of the key parameters of a compressor is the attack time, which is how fast does a compressor bring the volume down. As long as that signal stays above our threshold point, the compressor continues to act upon it at the completely adjusted volume level. And then once the signal goes back below the threshold, the compressor lets go and stops acting upon the signal. And we also can control that parameter, which is called the release time, in this case release phase, right? And that's how fast does a compressor let go. So if we looked at this as a very, very fast time frame, this means the signal popped above the threshold, we brought it down, and then it went back below the threshold, and we let it go. And the red line represents the output signal of our compressor. So the blue line's the input, and the red line is the output after the compressor has affected the signal. What I think to pay special attention to here is the actual decibel levels. So I'm going to give you four key terms. Attack time is how fast does the compressor engage with the audio. Release time is how fast, once the signal goes back below the threshold, does the compressor stop engaging with the audio. The threshold is the point at which the compressor engages with the audio. And the last term is the ratio. And the ratio is how much does the compressor engage with the audio. So I know that can be confusing if you don't know these terms. I get it, right? It's like a lot of information, even though it's 4 terms. It's like, what? And to try to keep track of that like real time is a lot. So I'll say them again, and then I'll explain the ratio in more depth. You can go back and check out that earlier part here for the threshold, attack time, and release time explanations. The 4 terms are attack time, meaning when the signal goes above the threshold, how fast does the compressor engage? How quickly does it see the signal? I like to think of this as a guy that's like watching the audio, and when it goes above a certain point, they've got their hand on a little fader and they bring it down. And you're saying, how fast do they bring that thing down? Like, are they like hyped up and like, ah? Or are they slower and they're like, oh, hey, it looks like it went above. Let's bring it down, right? That would be a slower attack time. The second term is the release time. Our guy's sitting there again. He's watching the signal. When it goes below the threshold, does he go, oh, looks like it went below the threshold. I guess I'll just bring this fader back up to not affecting the audio. The fader being the fader in the compressor. Or is he on the signal and it goes below and he's like, bam, bringing it back. So now I'm not affecting the signal. How fast is the reflexes of our compressor? The threshold is that point that you're going to make a change, right? I guess that's kind of the definition of any threshold, kind of. And then that 4th parameter is ratio. And ratio is the relationship of the signal input level to the signal output level. So a common set of ratios are 1.5 to 1, 2 to 1, sometimes 3 to 1, 4 to 1, and then you start seeing things jump to 8 to 1, 10 to 1, and after that you kind of get into extreme compressions, which is where you start to enter the world of limiters. For the ratio of a signal, of a compressor, generally a good starting place is 4 to 1. Now, this particular graph that we're looking at has a ratio of 2 to 1. And let's examine what that means. The ratio is the incoming signal compared to the outgoing signal. And it's how much do we modify, or in this case, decrease the volume of that signal. So if the signal is if our ratio is 2 to 1 and the signal comes in above the threshold 2 decibels, once we've fully engaged our compressor, the output should be 1 decibel above the threshold. If the if the signal came in 4 decibels above our threshold, the output after the full reduction of the compressor, full engagement, would be 2 decibels above the threshold. So it's a 4 to 2 ratio, which is the same as 2 to 1. If the signal came in 8 decibels above, the output would be 4 decibels above. If the signal came in 12 decibels above, the output would be 6 decibels above. That's a 2 to 1 ratio. So taking a look at our graph here, you can see our threshold is arbitrary numbers, but our threshold is at +3. And the incoming signal comes in, when it increases in level, it is 6 decibels above that +3 threshold. By the time our compressor has fully engaged, the outgoing signal is 3 decibels above our threshold at 6, right? Which means the incoming signal is 6 above and the outgoing signal is 3 above. I can't do 6 on this hand, which is a 2 to 1 ratio. So that's why, looking at this graph, I can tell the ratio of our compressor. I cannot tell you the exact attack time or release time because there's no parameters there. There's no actual values. But because there are level indicators, we can talk about specific ratios. So hopefully that makes sense. If you go and listen through that again, you'll be able to catch exactly what a ratio is. So this same compressor, if we had a 4 to 1 ratio, it'd be a little more difficult to figure out because there's a little bit of decimals, but we're 6 decibels above the threshold with our input. So what is our output if we turned up the ratio of our compressor to 4 to 1? I'll wait, I'm listening. The output would be 1.5 decibels above. So we would essentially see a similar graph go to 1.5 decibels above and then back up once we got to the release phase. If the ratio was 6 to 1, same input signal would go out 1 decibel above. And if we had a 6 to 1 ratio and the signal was 12 decibels, double, above our threshold, the output would only be 2 decibels above our threshold, right? And this is why when I started talking about ratios, I mentioned that once you get to about 10 to 1 or even 8 to 1, this is an extreme compression, and one to be very thoughtful about. And essentially, I would call that a limiter. So next, what I'd like to do is define a limiter. As I mentioned, is a type of compressor. A limiter is generally defined as a compressor with a very fast attack time, often under 2 milliseconds, a high ratio, often at least 10 to 1, though in digital systems these ratios can be kind of excessively high, 100 to 1 or something that's a brick wall, thus the term brick wall limiter, and usually a fast release. The threshold can still be adjusted pretty significantly. That's all dependent upon the level of the incoming signal. So that's what a limiter is. Fast, super fast attack, pretty high ratio, and often a fast release as well, though not always the case with the fast release. The last term that I will add in, which often is on most plugins and computer system processors, dynamic processors, but is not always present on all analog compressors, at least as a modifiable control you have access to, is makeup gain. And makeup gain is basically a volume control at the end of the compressor once everything has happened and engaged and let go and compressed or limited or whatever. It's another volume control that allows you to bring or adjust the level output of that processor unit. And this is why often people will talk about compressors making things louder. Once you've done the compression and reduced the dynamic range, you'll use makeup gain to bring the entire signal up. And don't underestimate the amount of sonic difference that compression can make. It is massive. And there are some very technical uses for compression to increase headroom on the front end of a recording system, and uses for it in a studio that are very, very important and aren't necessarily designed for aesthetics. But using a compressor in a way to create a sound or manipulate a sound can be very powerful. And you'll especially hear this change happen on transient instruments, things like drums, things like an acoustic guitar, can just be drastically changed for the better or worse by the use of compression. Things that are recorded in live rooms also, if you start hitting it really hard, well, you start to compress the actual dry signal of that instrument or voice, and the reverb of that room still exists, but it's not above the threshold. So when you come back to makeup gain and you lift it up, you've essentially increased the reverb in your signal. It's also affected transients and stuff. So using a compressor can be very effective and takes a lot of just time playing with it and figuring out what works. This diagram shows that signal, same signal, and what it might actually look like. So this would be a good time to kind of pause the video and review those terms I've mentioned. Incoming signal on the top, outgoing signal on the bottom. Here's the attack time where you can see that slowly going in. And then the 3 decibels above the threshold, and then it goes out, and you can see the release time as it lets go and completes its path back to the original level of the audio signal. And then you can see a graph of that not affected, attack time, fully affected, and then release time back to not affected. Awesome. Now we're going to move on to gates. This is in fact a compressor. I know it says a compressor or gate. It was a question, but we're going to take a look at gate. Boom. All right. So here we have a gate. And what this shows us is the opposite effect of a compressor. I use the term opposite. It's not the best term, but I think it helps people think about how this processor works. If we look at our same incoming signal here below our threshold point, it then pops up, continues, and then goes back below our threshold point, we can start to understand a gate. And I'm going to start off with a very simple physical relationship of these two things. A gate, think of as a actual physical gate on a farm, right? And if you have your gate and you have some sheep and you close the gate, the sheep cannot get through, and they cannot get out here to graze. If you have enough sheep pushing against that gate, they can open the gate and run out and get some nice clovers. Then when they come back home, you can close the gate behind them. And in this way, you can control what gets out to graze and what doesn't, or when it doesn't. That is how a gate works with an audio signal. The audio signal comes close to the threshold, but when it exceeds the threshold, the gate opens and the audio can be heard by your audience. And when it goes back below the threshold, the gate automatically closes behind it, and your audience can't hear it at all, despite whatever's going on over here. Right? So if your sheep are still running around in the pen, it's irrelevant because the gate is closed. But as soon as they decide to push through and get really loud, then your audience can hear them. And that gate will remain open as long as they're out there grazing. That's a physical representation of how a gate works, the way that I like to think about it at least. And it's cute because sheep. So let's check it out on this graph. We have our signal in blue, and it is below the threshold. And the output level keeps it significantly below that threshold. And in fact, in a proper gate, it cuts it off completely. Now, the signal pops up above the threshold here, and our gate, our person watching the gate goes, oh, looks like the sheep pushing against this threshold point. And he opens, or she opens the gate, and we see that signal, the attack phase of our gate, as it goes up and lets the signal through at its full volume. Then the signal jumps back below the gate. We have an additional parameter here called hold time, which I'll talk about in a second. And then our guy goes, yep, it's for sure, they're back in, they've come below the gate, and then slowly closes the gate here until the signal goes back above that threshold point. Now, just as a thought experiment, if you took a gated signal, this same signal, gated it first, then sent it to the compressor, the effect would be very different than our original compression signal, because essentially you'd be sending the output level of a gate, which is down here, and then slowly ramps up above our threshold, and then sort of comes back down and holds and then goes down. That envelope of change is very different than our original signal. And we are drastically changing the amplitude that would enter the compressor if we lined up the gate first and then a compressor. So something to think about, right? Like, how do I put these? In what order do I put these things? And how would they affect each other sonically? Because amplitude is a vital part of how we hear sounds. That combined with sort of the spectral temporal response of those sounds. Hopefully that makes sense with the threshold and the gate, bringing the level down when it's below the threshold, opening up as it goes above, and then closing back down afterwards. As I mentioned, there's this extra parameter called hold. So similar parameters to a compressor. We have a threshold point, which is when does the gate take effect? When does it open? We have a attack phase or attack time, which is how fast does the gate open. We have a release time, which is how fast does the gate close. We also have a hold time. And a hold time is basically a buffer where you kind of look at the signal and go like, how long do I just keep the gate open to make sure, and then close it. And that hold time can be really, really valuable in, once again, shaping the sound of transient sources, but also to make sure that your gate doesn't sound choppy, that it doesn't cut on when someone's speaking, for example, and then chop off, right? So when they speak, if it was white noise, room sound, you shh, shh, shh. If every time that someone was speaking, you heard that and then it backed out, it would become very obvious. But if it kind of went shh, and it sort of swelled up, that hold time allows the gate to sort of go like, is something else going to come in? Oh, something else came in, so it's still open. So it gives us this buffer zone, which is critical for high quality audio, especially I've found in loud environments for recording purposes, where you just can't hear the noise coming on and off behind something in post-production, for example. It becomes super obvious that there's noise. Whereas if it's more constant and sort of going in and out with the vocals, it's less obvious to the final listener. So those are the key parameters of a gate. And now, modifying that slightly, we'll talk about an expander, which is going to have this, let's say, sixth parameter called range. And range is sort of like a ratio. It's how much the reduction is when the gate is closed. So you can have a range of a decibel range I've seen, as well as a ratio range, depending on the processor. But it's how much is that reduction when the signal is below the threshold. So if it's a 2-to-1 ratio on a gate, that means when it's below by, say, 1 decibel, it reduces it by 2 decibels. If it's below by 5 decibels, it would reduce it to 10 decibels below. So the farther below it is, it gets reduced even more. If it's a specific amount of reduction, which is the term for range, then it would be like if it's 5 decibels below, it gets reduced, say the range is 10 decibels, it gets reduced to 15. If it's 10 decibels below, it gets reduced to 20. If it's 1 decibel below, it gets reduced to 11, because it's just a specific amount of reduction when it's below that threshold point. And I think that this is probably a little easier to demonstrate in practice, but for now I'm going to keep this this demonstration purely theoretical because it's long. Hopefully that makes sense as a basic overview for compression and limiting and gates and expanders, which are our primary 4 dynamic processors. I'm going to do another video for the other processors because that got really long. But I hope that that's helpful in walking through kind of how these processors, the dynamic processors, can be used and how they work. It's not super complicated, but it is super diverse in how it can affect the sound and clarity of your audio. These can be found in every processor, every computer, DAW, most consoles, but definitely outboard gear that a lot of engineers would use in both live and recording and post-production settings. So with that, I'll say goodbye, and I'll do a different video for the spectral processors and the temporal processors. Thanks.